It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon at the park. Children played on the swings, families laughed over picnic lunches, and the sun warmed the quiet scene. But everything changed when a young activist named Olivia noticed an elderly veteran sitting on a nearby bench, his military cap resting proudly on his head. Without warning, Olivia confronted the man, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You think wearing that hat makes you a hero? You're nothing but a baby killer." The crowd fell silent, stunned by her harsh words. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances while others froze, unsure of how to respond. The veteran, Mr. Harris, remained quiet, his weathered hands resting on his cane as he listened without protest. Nearby, his young son, Noah, clutched his father's arm, eyes wide with confusion and fear. He didn't understand why someone would speak to his father this way, but the words were already cutting deep, shaking the peaceful moment into something far more intense. Just as it seemed, the tension couldn't rise any higher. The silence was shattered, not by anger, but by the voice of a child. Noah, with tears in his eyes, stepped forward. What he said next would change the entire crowd's perspective and leave them all in tears. The sun still shone brightly, but the warmth felt as though it had drained from the park. Olivia stood with her arms crossed, her face tight with indignation as she stared down at Mr. Harris. The words she had just hurled still hung heavily in the air. "You think you're a hero?" she repeated, her voice louder now. "Wearing that uniform like it erases the blood on your hands? How many innocent lives were taken because of people like you?" The park had gone silent. Conversations halted, parents pulled their children closer, and joggers slowed, glancing over their shoulders. The peaceful atmosphere had shifted, replaced with tension thick enough to feel. Mr. Harris didn't move. His hands, trembling slightly from age, rested gently over his cane. His eyes, soft yet tired, remained fixed on Olivia with calm restraint. He could feel the sting of her words, but didn't flinch. Nearby, his son Noah, no older than 10, gripped his father's sleeve tightly, his knuckles pale from how hard he held on. His small voice trembled, barely audible. "Dad, why is she saying that?" Mr. Harris gently placed his hand on Noah's, patting it reassuringly. "It's okay, son. Not everyone understands." But Olivia wasn't done. "Not everyone understands? I understand perfectly." Her voice echoed as she pointed at his military cap. "You fought for a system that destroyed families, that took lives for profit. Don't expect people to stay silent while you walk around flaunting your so-called service." A few onlookers exchanged glances. Some appeared uncomfortable, others seemed curious, but no one spoke up. Jake, a young man who had been watching from a nearby bench, clenched his jaw. His mind raced. He wanted to speak, but something held him back. What if she turned on me next? What if I just made things worse? But Noah's face, pale, frightened, was hard to ignore. Finally, Olivia crossed her arms, looking down at Mr. Harris. "Well, don't you have anything to say for yourself?" For the first time, Mr. Harris spoke. His voice was steady but kind. "Miss, I won't argue with you. I served not for praise, but because I believed in protecting others. You may not agree with the choices I made, but my intention was never to hurt the innocent. I've lost friends who gave everything, and their sacrifices deserve respect." Olivia scoffed. "Respect? For what? For following orders? For violence disguised as heroism?" Noah, trembling, looked up at his father with tear-filled eyes. The tension in the crowd was thick, the discomfort growing heavier with every word exchanged. And then Noah did something no one expected. He let go of his father's sleeve, stepped forward, and spoke, his voice shaky but louder than before. "My dad is the bravest person I know. He prays every night that there won't be any more wars. He tells me about his friends who didn't come back. He helps people who feel sad because of what happened to them. You don't know him. You don't know how much he cares." The entire park seemed to exhale, the sudden vulnerability piercing through the tension like a blade. Olivia blinked, taken aback. Mr. Harris, his voice soft, added, "I've never needed thanks for my service. but I won't let you take away my son's belief in doing what's right." For a moment, Olivia's lips parted as if to respond, but she hesitated. The rawness of Noah's words seemed to disarm her, even if only slightly. The crowd, once silent, was now watching more closely. Something was shifting. The park remained frozen, as if time had momentarily stopped. Olivia's sharp words still lingered in the air, yet it was the voice of young Noah that echoed the loudest. His small frame stood in front of his father protectively, his chest rising and falling with emotion. A hush spread over the crowd. Parents whispered to one another. Teenagers who had been watching from the swings now stood still, their curiosity overtaken by quiet tension. No one knew what to do or say. Olivia, momentarily stunned by Noah's heartfelt defense, seemed to wrestle with her next move. Her lips pressed together as if searching for words to regain control, but her voice was softer when she finally spoke. I'm sorry if you're hurting, kid, but you don't understand. You're just a child. You don't know the history, the damage people like him have caused. They didn't protect us. They hurt people." Noah's face twisted in confusion. His voice, trembling but determined, cut through the awkward silence. "But my dad did protect people. He never hurts anyone. He helps our neighbors. He tells me stories about his friends who saved people, even when they got hurt. You don't know him." Tears welled in his eyes, but his words didn't waver. Mr. Harris finally placed a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder, pulling him back slightly. His voice, calm and measured, broke the thick tension. "Son, you've said enough. Thank you for standing up for me. But let me speak now." Noah nodded, wiping his eyes, while Mr. Harris turned back to Olivia. "Miss," he began, his voice soft yet unwavering, "I understand your anger. I've seen things no one should have to see. I live with those memories every day. And I've lost people, friends, who died trying to protect the innocent. I wear this cap not to boast but to remember them." Olivia's expression hardened, but her voice lacked the same intensity. "Then why don't you talk about the innocent lives lost, the people caught in the crossfire? You defend violence like it's honorable." Mr. Harris shook his head gently. "No, I'm not defending violence. I hate it. I hate that it exists. I served hoping my children, and yours, would never have to see it firsthand. The cost of war is heavy, and I carry that weight every single day." The crowd stirred. Some nodded quietly. Others simply listened, drawn in by the raw honesty in his voice. Jake, who had remained silent on the bench, clenched his fists. His heart pounded. Someone needs to speak up for him. But before he could move, Noah's voice broke the silence again. "My dad tells me being brave doesn't mean hurting people. It means helping when you're scared, like his friends who tried to save the little girl from the fire when they were overseas. He prays every night for peace, not war." Olivia blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in the child's words. The tension had shifted. The confrontation wasn't over, but the crowd wasn't just observing anymore. They were feeling. The tension in the park had shifted, but it hadn't disappeared. Olivia stood her ground, arms crossed, her face conflicted as Noah's trembling voice still echoed in the air. The crowd remained hushed, unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation unfold. Jake sat on the nearby bench, his hands gripping the edge as he watched the scene unfold. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't usually one to get involved in public conflicts, but something about this felt wrong. He couldn't shake the image of Noah standing in front of his father, fighting to defend him. The boy's courage stirred something deep within him. Why isn't anyone saying anything? Why am I just sitting here? Jake finally stood, his pulse racing as he approached the group. His voice was calm but firm. "Hey, enough," he said, directing his words toward Olivia. "You've made your point. But there's a difference between speaking out and attacking someone who doesn't deserve it." Olivia's eyes narrowed, regaining her defensive posture. "And who are you? Another soldier defender? You think wearing a uniform makes someone above criticism? How many innocent lives were taken under the excuse of service?" Jake shook his head, keeping his voice steady. No, I'm not defending war. I'm defending basic human decency. Look at his son. Do you really think shaming a child's father in front of him proves anything? Mr. Harris, still calm, but clearly exhausted, raised a hand. Jake, you don't have to do this. I can handle it. But Jake wasn't backing down. No, sir, this isn't right. You served your country and you don't deserve to be humiliated like this. It's okay to have opinions about war, but turning it into a personal attack, especially in front of his son, that crosses a line. Olivia's face flushed, but her voice cracked slightly. You don't know what I've been through. My brother was a soldier too. He came home broken. PTSD, nightmares, the whole thing. He wasn't a hero. He was used. And I'm tired of people worshiping that uniform like it's sacred when all it did was destroy my family. The crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others looked torn, understanding her pain but unsettled by her approach. Jake's expression softened as he replied, I'm sorry about your brother. Truly. No one's saying war isn't complicated or that the pain soldiers carry isn't real, but blaming him. He gestured to Mr. Harris. Isn't the answer. He's hurting too. For the first time, Olivia faltered. Her stance remained rigid, but the fire in her eyes dimmed just slightly. Jake continued, lowering his voice. We're all hurting in some way, but tearing people down doesn't bring healing. Maybe we should try listening instead of assuming the worst about each other. The park had never felt so quiet. The park was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant laughter of children too young to understand the tension filling the air. Olivia stared at Jake, her expression torn between defiance and uncertainty. The emotional weight was pressing harder, but she still looked ready to argue. Before she could respond, Mr. Harris gently stepped forward. His voice, though calm, held a quiet strength that commanded attention. Miss, he began, his eyes meeting Olivia's without hostility. I've heard your pain, and I'm truly sorry for what your brother went through. I've seen those struggles up close. I've lived with them too. But I need you to understand something. His voice trembled slightly as he continued. I didn't serve to glorify violence. I served because I believed that protecting others mattered. I've buried friends, good men, who didn't make it home. They didn't fight for politics or profit. They fought for the person next to them, hoping their sacrifice would mean something. The crowd was completely still. Olivia's arms loosened at her sides, her face no longer burning with the same anger as before. Mr. Harris looked down at his son Noah, who stood silently, his hand clutching his father's. My son shouldn't have to see me disrespected like this. I don't wear this hat for attention. I wear it because it reminds me of the friends I lost, the men who never got the chance to grow old, to be here with their families. He turned back to Olivia, voice softer but still steady. You're angry, and you have every right to be. War leaves scars on those who serve and on the families left behind. But please, don't mistake my silence for guilt or pride. I stay quiet because words can't explain the weight of what we've seen, but I promise you this, I don't celebrate violence. I grieve it. A single voice from the crowd whispered, He's right. Another nodded. For the first time, Olivia seemed to falter completely. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Her chest rose and fell, breathing heavier. Jake broke the silence. Maybe it's time we stop assuming the worst in each other and start listening. The confrontation was no longer about proving a point. It had shifted into something deeper. The silence in the park felt heavier now, not with tension but with the weight of unspoken truths. Mr. Harris's words had shifted the energy, but the confrontation wasn't over. Olivia stood motionless, arms slack at her sides, her face pale with conflicting emotions. Suddenly, Noah, who had been clinging quietly to his father's side, stepped forward. His small voice broke through the quiet, trembling but strong. Miss, my dad is not a bad man. The crowd shifted, all eyes now on the young boy as he looked up at Olivia with tear-filled eyes. Noah continued, voice cracking but determined. He prays every night. He tells me about his friend, or the ones who didn't come back. He told me they weren't fighting because they wanted to. They were protecting people. My dad never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt others first. His voice quivered, but he pressed on, glancing at his father. He gets really quiet sometimes when he thinks about the war. He doesn't talk about it much. But I've seen him help people too, like Mr. Grant from church when he didn't have food, or when he gives money to the homeless people near the grocery store. My dad is kind. He loves people. He's not a killer. A tear slipped down Olivia's cheek, though she quickly wiped it away. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Noah looked back at his father and then returned his gaze to Olivia. You said bad things about my dad, but you don't know him. He helps people. He helps me, and I'm proud of him. The crowd was no longer frozen in discomfort. Now, they were visibly moved. A mother in the back clutched her chest. A man near the picnic tables lowered his head, clearly emotional. Mr. Harris bent down and gently placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. It's okay, son, he whispered softly. You've said enough. But Noah shook his head and whispered back, She needs to know the truth, Dad. Jake, standing nearby, felt his throat tighten. The simplicity of Noah's words cut deeper than any argument could have. Olivia's lips trembled, her defiance cracking further. The confrontation was shifting, not from confrontation, but toward something much more profound. The silence that followed Noah's heartfelt words was overwhelming. Olivia blinked rapidly, her face pale, lips pressed tightly together as if struggling to hold something back. The crowd, once a silent audience, had begun to feel more like witnesses to something deeply personal. Olivia's defenses, once so rigid, finally cracked. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said softly, her voice shaking. She paused, exhaling shakily before her words rushed out. I lost my brother 2 years ago. He was a soldier too. The crowd seemed to exhale, collectively. Some faces showed understanding, others surprise. Olivia continued, her voice quivering, the anger giving way to raw pain. He was different when he came back. He couldn't sleep. He wouldn't talk about it. When he finally did, he said he couldn't forget the things he saw, the things he had to do. And then, she swallowed hard. He took his life. I found him. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Even Jake, who had been silently backing up Mr. Harris, looked visibly shaken. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. I hated the military after that. I hated everything it stood for. The medals, the flags, the caps. I blamed all of it, because none of it brought him back. Her voice cracked further, barely a whisper now. And when I saw you sitting there wearing that cap, I thought you were like the people who used him, who broke him. Mr. Harris, his face calm but deeply sympathetic, nodded gently. His eyes glistened, but he stayed composed. I'm so sorry for your loss, he said, voice gentle but firm. Your pain is real, but I promise you, most of us, we carry the same pain. We don't wear this for glory. We wear it to remember the ones we lost too. Noah whispered softly. My dad gets sad sometimes too. He talks to God about his friends. I think he misses them a lot. Olivia covered her face with her hands, her sobs quiet but uncontrolled. The pain she had buried for so long had finally surfaced. The confrontation had shifted completely. What started as anger had become a moment of shared grief. The park felt heavier, not with tension but with the weight of shared grief. Olivia's quiet sobs echoed softly as the crowd remained silent, absorbing the raw vulnerability she had just shared. Mr. Harris took a step closer, his eyes filled with empathy. His voice was gentle, steady, like a man who had carried this weight for far too long. Olivia, He began softly. I can't imagine the pain you've carried losing your brother. No family should ever have to face that kind of loss. And I know. Because I've lost friends too. Good men. Men who went into battle not to destroy but to protect, and some came home carrying wounds too deep for words. Olivia wiped her face, her breath still shaky. Then, why do people like you still wear those uniforms? The medals? The caps? Doesn't it just remind you of all of it? Mr. Harris nodded, pausing to gather his thoughts. It does, but it's not for me, Olivia. I wear this cap for the ones who never came home, for the men who didn't get to hold their children again, for the families left behind wondering why. He paused, voice thick with emotion. I wear this cap so they're never forgotten. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. Someone whispered, "He's right." Mr. Harris continued, glancing down at Noah. My son. He's proud of me, but he doesn't know everything I've seen. I've kept those memories away from him because they aren't things a child should have to carry. But I want him to know that bravery isn't about violence. It's about standing up for what's right even when it hurts. Olivia's shoulders sagged. I didn't know. I thought you were just proud of war. Mr. Harris shook his head. No, ma'am. I'm proud of those who stood when they were called, not of the wars they fought. There's a difference. The crowd had shifted from mere onlookers to witnesses of something deeply human. The anger was gone. What remained was healing. The park remained silent, the confrontation now transformed into something much deeper. Olivia stood with her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her once fiery expression now softened with sorrow. She took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes welling up again as she turned toward Mr. Harris. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. The crowd shifted, people leaned in, the tension fully dissolved, replaced by curiosity and empathy. I was wrong, Olivia continued louder this time. I let my pain make me cruel. I judged you without knowing who you are. I let my anger at what happened to my brother make me see everyone in uniform as the enemy, and I was wrong for that. Noah looked up at his father, confused but hopeful. Mr. Harris nodded gently, stepping forward with his hand extended. His voice was calm, steady. Thank you, Olivia. It takes courage to admit when we've let pain blind us. I forgive you. A single clap echoed from the crowd, then another. Soon the entire park was applauding softly, not in celebration but in a show of respect, for both Olivia's courage to apologize and Mr. Harris's grace in forgiving her. Jake, still standing nearby, added softly, This is what we need more of. Understanding, compassion, not anger. Olivia wiped her tears but offered a faint smile. Thank you for being patient, for listening, even when I didn't. Mr. Harris nodded. That's how healing begins. The crowd had shifted entirely, once bystanders, now participants in something deeper, human connection, healing, and grace. The soft applause faded, but the sense of unity lingered in the air. The crowd wasn't just observing anymore. They were feeling the shift. People exchanged nods, quiet whispers filling the space as the emotional weight settled in. Jake, still standing nearby, watched as Olivia wiped her eyes again, her head bowed slightly. The anger that had once burned in her gaze was replaced by vulnerability. Mr. Harris, still standing tall but visibly emotional, took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. We all carry pain, he began, his voice calm but resonant. We've all lost something, or someone. But what we do with that pain, that's what matters. We can let it harden us, or we can let it teach us how to be better, how to show compassion. Several people in the crowd nodded. A father with his young daughter resting on his shoulders looked visibly moved. Olivia nodded, her voice softer, but sincere. I let my pain make me bitter. I thought I was standing up for justice, but all I did was hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I can't take back my words, but I'll do better. I have to do better. Jake stepped forward, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had shifted. We all need to do better. It's easy to make assumptions, to forget there's a story behind every face we see. But today, we witnessed something powerful, understanding, and that's rare these days. The crowd seemed to absorb his words deeply. People weren't just watching, they were reflecting on their own experiences, their own pain. Noah's voice, small but strong, broke the silence again. My dad says being brave means helping people, even when it's scary. Mr. Harris nodded gently, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. That's right, son. The park felt different now. The confrontation had transformed into something else entirely: healing, empathy, and unity. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, it was clear they would carry this moment with them. Days after the emotional moment at the park, a video of the confrontation surfaced online. Someone in the crowd had captured the entire exchange: Olivia's accusations, Mr. Harris's quiet strength, Noah's tearful defense, and the powerful moment of reconciliation. It spread rapidly. People across the country shared the video, not because of conflict, but because of how it ended, with understanding, forgiveness, and healing. Comment sections overflowed with reactions. This is what we need more of: real conversations, not anger. That little boy taught us all something today. Respect to Mr. Harris for showing what true strength looks like. Meanwhile, Olivia was reflecting on the experience herself. She couldn't stop thinking about Noah's words, the raw sincerity of a child defending his father. One evening, she reached out to Mr. Harris through a message she wasn't sure he would ever read. I just wanted to thank you again for your kindness that day. I've thought a lot since then. I'm working on healing my own pain, and I want you to know I'm proud to say I was wrong. Mr. Harris responded with simple words that carried the same wisdom he had shown in the park. Healing takes time, Olivia, but it begins with grace, for others and for yourself. Stay strong. And Noah? He returned to school the next day, proud of his father in a way words couldn't describe. Sometimes a single act of compassion could change hearts. Sometimes forgiveness could echo further than anger ever could.